As months passed, the story of Brutus grew larger than life. What had begun as a single act of vengeance became a myth carried on the tongues of slaves, whispered in the dark like a forbidden prayer. But like all stories, it changed in the telling. Some said Brutus had killed not just Harrow, but a dozen overseers in the same night, their bodies left scattered across the plantation like broken dolls. Others swore he had burned the house to the ground, standing in the flames as if fire itself could not harm him. There were tales that he had vanished into the mountains, gathering runaways to his side, forging a secret army of the enslaved waiting to strike. The legend of Brutus spread far beyond Birmingham. In taverns, he was spoken of in hushed tones, white men drinking away their fear as they muttered, "The Crusher is out there. If he comes for us, God help us all." Among the enslaved, he was a symbol of freedom, a man who had turned his chains into weapons, who had proven that masters could fall. But reality was harsher, quieter, less forgiving. The truth was that Brutus was alone. He had no army, no hidden camp of rebels. He had no allies beyond the whispers of those who dared not speak his name too loudly. He was a man hunted, starving in the woods, sleeping in caves, surviving on roots and stolen scraps. Yet even in solitude, he carried the weight of legend, and perhaps that legend was enough. For the power of Brutus lay not only in what he had done, but in what others believed he had done. Fear spread through the white South, hope spread among the enslaved, and in that space between myth and truth, Brutus became untouchable. The hunters still scoured the land, still told themselves he would be found, cornered, destroyed. But with every passing day, the man they hunted became less a man and more a shadow, an idea that could not be chained, could not be whipped, could not be killed. And perhaps that was Brutus's greatest victory. For whether he was still alive in the forests, still running, still clutching his hammer in bloodied hands, or whether he had fallen, body left nameless in a shallow grave, the legend endured. The truth may have been lost. Maybe Brutus died in silence, his body swallowed by the earth, erased by those who feared him. Or maybe he slipped away, vanishing into the north, beyond the reach of his hunters, living out his days as a free man under another name. But history has a strange way of preserving what it wishes. And in Birmingham, the truth of Brutus mattered less than the myth of Brutus, because in the end, Brutus had already won. He had proven that a man in chains could strike down his master. He had planted fear where there had once been arrogance, and hope where there had once been despair. And for those who whispered his name in the dark, Brutus was not just a man. He was a symbol, a legend, a warning. And perhaps even now the echo of his hammer still lingers in the soil of Birmingham, reminding all who hear it that power, no matter how absolute, can always be broken. When the hammer fell silent, and the forests of Birmingham swallowed Brutus whole, a new war began, not of rifles and dogs, but of words, silence, and deliberate forgetting. The white establishment of the South understood something dangerous. Brutus's story was not just blood and rebellion. It was a crack in the foundation of their power. The memory of a slave rising, killing his master with raw strength, and vanishing into the wilderness was a poison. If left unchecked, it would spread. Others might take inspiration, might see that the chains were not unbreakable, that the master's flesh could bleed. So Birmingham chose erasure. Official records of the Harrow plantation became strangely thin. Where there should have been testimony, court proceedings, newspaper coverage, there was only silence. The county clerk recorded Harrow's death simply as accidental injury sustained in the home. No mention of Brutus, no trial, no investigation. The sheriff who had gathered hunters swore to secrecy. He told his men, "We will not speak his name again "We will not make him a martyr." Rewards posters were quietly removed. Stories in taverns were dismissed as drunken lies. The local press, heavily controlled by wealthy landowners, ran only vague lines about unfortunate disturbances on the Harrow estate. But erasure has a paradoxical effect. The more authorities tried to bury Brutus's memory, the more it whispered in the margins. Among the enslaved, the silence became proof of his power. They saw through the lies. They knew Harrow had not died from some accident. They remembered the blood, the screams, the hammer's echo. And when the official records said nothing, the people filled the silence with stories of their own. Thus, Brutus transformed from fugitive into phantom. A ghost, not because he was dead, but because history itself tried to kill him. White society feared his story for two reasons. First, it shattered their myth of absolute control. If Brutus could strike, then so could others. Second, it revealed their own fragility. Plantation power rested on terror, but Brutus had shown that terror could be reversed. That realization was too dangerous to allow into textbooks, sermons, or political speeches. So Brutus was scrubbed away, like a stain on the city's history. When northern abolitionists later pressed Birmingham for accounts of slave uprisings, officials denied any knowledge. "Nothing of the sort has ever happened here," they insisted. The silence became official doctrine, but the human memory is harder to bury than paper. In the slave quarters, the story of Brutus became oral history. Mothers told their children, "Once there was a man who crushed his master's skull with the same hammer he used to build his chains." Around fires, whispered in the hush of night, Brutus lived on, not in ink, but in breath. Every generation added new layers. Some claimed Brutus's hammer was still hidden in the woods, buried beneath oak roots, waiting for another hand to find it. Others believed his spirit walked the plantations, watching, reminding the enslaved that rebellion was always possible. Ironically, the cover-up gave birth to the legend. The attempt to erase him made him immortal, for when you strip away the facts, what remains is myth, and myths cannot be chained. To this day, Birmingham carries no plaques, no monuments, no official recognition of Brutus. But silence speaks louder than stone. The very absence is a confession. They tried to erase him because they feared him, and that fear, preserved in shadows, ensures Brutus will never truly be forgotten. Legends are born not from facts, but from the emotions they ignite. And Brutus, the enslaved man who became the crusher, left behind a legacy not written in books, but carved into the soul of every man who ever felt a chain on his wrist. For the enslaved, Brutus became proof that the impossible was possible. In the suffocating despair of bondage, where each sunrise meant another day of toil, another lash of the whip, Brutus stood as a reminder. Masters could fall. His act of defiance was more than violence, it was prophecy. His story spread like wildfire, whispered from plantation to plantation, carried by traveling traders, smuggled into northern abolitionist circles. Some painted him as a warrior, others as a martyr, still others as a ghost who could not be caught. But no matter the version, the message was the same. Resistance was not madness. Resistance was power. In secret gatherings, enslaved men and women spoke his name as a vow. "We are Brutus," they whispered. The hammer became a symbol, a tool of labor turned into a weapon of liberation. Chains were no longer symbols of submission, but potential weapons waiting for the right moment. Brutus's legend inspired fear not only in Birmingham, but across the South. Plantation owners tightened their patrols, doubled their punishments, built taller fences. They lived in constant paranoia that another Brutus was hiding among their slaves, waiting for the moment to strike. The memory of his rebellion became a silent war that lingered long after his footsteps disappeared. But beyond fear and hope, Brutus became something greater, a lesson in the nature of power. His life revealed the truth that power built on cruelty is fragile, brittle, always one hammer blow away from collapse. Masters may have owned the land, the whips, the rifles, but Brutus proved that ownership is an illusion. Strength, courage, and rage could shatter it in a single night. Generations later, when slavery ended, when freedom was proclaimed, whispers of Brutus remained. He became part of the hidden folklore of the South. His story did not make it into schoolbooks, but it lived in songs, in stories, in the restless fire of rebellion that carried forward into new struggles for justice. Even today, his name carries weight. Historians argue about whether he truly survived, whether his hammer still lies buried in Birmingham soil. But those debates miss the point. Whether Brutus the man lived or died, Brutus the symbol cannot die. He represents the unkillable spirit of resistance, the fury that rises when men are pushed past endurance, the fire that cannot be chained, cannot be bought, cannot be erased. Brutus reminds us of a truth the powerful always fear, no matter how deep the chains, no matter how brutal the system, there will always come a moment when the oppressed rise, and when they rise, they strike with the strength of history itself. In the silence of Birmingham's archives, in the fear of its landowners, in the whispers of its forgotten children, Brutus lives on, not as a fugitive, not as a slave, but as a legend carved in blood and iron, the crusher of Birmingham, the man who turned chains into weapons, the ghost who proved that freedom is always one hammer blow away. The silence after the hammer's final strike was heavier than any sound. The master was gone, his skull reduced to ruin, his body sprawled lifeless across the desk that once symbolized his power. For a brief moment, the plantation seemed still, as though time itself had stopped, but silence never lasts. The first to stir were the hounds. They howled into the night, their cries piercing through the plantation like alarms. In the slave quarters, men and women sat up in terror, their eyes darting toward the main house. They had heard the thunderous cracks, the echo of wood splintering, the unnatural rhythm of violence. Whispers spread quickly. It has happened. Brutus has done it. The crusher has struck. Fear and awe mixed in equal measure. For the slaves, this was something beyond imagination. To raise a hand against a master was to invite death not just for oneself, but for everyone. And yet, Brutus had done it. He had crossed the unthinkable line. The overseers were next. Armed men, roused from their beds by the dogs' cries, grabbed rifles and lanterns and rushed toward the house. Their boots pounded against the dirt, their voices barking questions into the darkness. Some shouted for the slaves to stay where they were. Others cursed at the confusion. But none yet knew the truth, that the man they served lay in pieces inside his study. When they reached the house, the stench of blood hit them first. The lantern light revealed the broken door, the scattered papers, the shattered desk. And then they saw him. Ezekiel Harrow, master of the estate, breaker of men, lay ruined, his head caved in, the floor slick with red. The men recoiled in horror. Some gagged, others whispered prayers. None had ever seen such destruction. A bullet could kill, a knife could wound. But this was something else. This was annihilation. One overseer muttered, trembling, "No man could do this." But deep inside, they all knew. One man could. One man had the strength. Brutus. Panic erupted. Orders were shouted, rifles loaded, hounds unleashed. The overseers stormed the slave quarters, lanterns blazing, demanding answers. The slaves kept silent, their faces blank masks of fear. None dared betray Brutus, not out of love, but out of awe. They had seen something that could not be undone, a man who had shattered the unbreakable chain. The plantation descended into chaos. Overseers feared rebellion, certain that Brutus's act was the spark for a larger uprising. They imagined torches, knives, and hammers rising in every hand, the slaves storming the house in vengeance. Fear twisted their minds, and fear spread beyond the plantation. Word traveled quickly in the south. Within days, whispers spread through Birmingham. A slave has killed his master, smashed his skull like an animal. The story grew with each telling. Some claimed Brutus had crushed not just Harrow, but the overseers too. Others swore he had torn through the hounds with his bare hands. The truth was simple but terrifying enough. A man once bound in chains had struck down his master and lived. For the slave-holding elite, this was the ultimate nightmare. If one man could rise, others might follow. If Brutus's story spread, it could ignite rebellion across the South. So they resolved to do what men in power always do when fear takes root: hunt, silence, erase. And thus, the chase began. The night swallowed Brutus as he left the plantation behind. His body was streaked with sweat and blood, the hammer still heavy in his grip, but he carried no fear. He carried only resolve. He knew the overseers would come. He knew the dogs would be unleashed. He knew the world outside the plantation would not welcome him as a hero, but as a monster. Yet none of it mattered. For the first time in his life, he had chosen his own path, and he would walk it no matter where it led. The woods beyond the Harrow estate were thick and unforgiving. Brutus moved like a shadow among the trees, his massive frame blending into the night as best it could. Every twig that snapped beneath his feet seemed like thunder in his ears, every rustle of leaves a signal of pursuit. Yet he pressed on, guided by instinct and desperation. Behind him, the plantation exploded with activity. Lanterns flickered in the distance, rifles cracked in the air, and the baying of hounds grew louder. The hunt had begun. Brutus knew the hounds well. He had seen them tear apart runaways before, their jaws locking onto flesh with merciless strength. But Brutus was not like the others. He was not weak, not starved by fear. His hammer was more than a tool now. It was a promise. He crossed streams to mask his scent, doubled back through thickets to confuse the dogs, and pressed deeper into the wilderness. Yet the pursuit was relentless. The men behind him were not merely hunting a fugitive. They were hunting a legend in the making, a symbol that threatened to unravel their entire world. Hours passed. The moon dipped lower. Still, Brutus pressed on, his breath heavy, his body aching, but his spirit unbroken. He thought of the slaves left behind, the whispers that would spread, the fear in the overseer's eyes. He had struck one blow for himself, but perhaps, just perhaps, it had been for them all. As dawn approached, Brutus paused atop a ridge, gazing down at the land stretching endlessly before him. Freedom lay somewhere beyond the horizon, maybe in the north, maybe in some hidden place, far from the reach of whips and chains. He did not know, but he did know this: he would never again bow, never again be shackled, never again let another man claim to own his flesh. The sound of the hounds grew nearer, the rifles cracked once more. Brutus tightened his grip on the hammer and turned toward the noise. His eyes, dark and burning, held no fear. If they wanted the crusher, they would have to earn him, and the legend of Brutus, the fugitive who turned the tools of bondage into weapons of freedom, marched deeper into the heart of history. The morning. After Harrow's skull was shattered, Birmingham awoke to a terror unlike any it had known before. Word spread faster than the rising sun. A slave had killed his master. Not with poison, not with a knife in the dark, but with brute force, with the very tool of labor, a sledgehammer. For the white landowners of Birmingham, this was not just murder. It was a nightmare made flesh. Their carefully built world of dominance, their belief in total control, had been cracked like Harrow's skull. If Brutus could rise, if Brutus could strike, then every man in chains carried the same potential. And so Birmingham responded not with justice, but with fear. The hunters were assembled before the blood on Harrow's floor had even dried. Overseers, slave catchers, bounty men hardened by years of chasing runaways, all were summoned. They gathered at the plantation gates, rifles in hand, hounds straining at their leashes, faces twisted with determination and unease. The sheriff himself arrived, grim-faced and tight-lipped. "This is no ordinary runaway," he told them. "This is a monster, a beast in a man's skin. He must be brought down before his sickness spreads." But beneath their bravado, fear gnawed at them. Each hunter had seen men run before, thin, desperate souls starving in the woods, easy prey for dogs and bullets. Brutus was different. Brutus was strong, cunning, and unafraid. He had killed not in panic, but with purpose, and that purpose made him dangerous. The manhunt began. They scoured the fields and forests, the dogs baying as they caught the faintest whiff of blood and sweat. Trails were followed, then lost, as Brutus crossed streams and doubled back, leaving confusion in his wake. Still, the hunters pressed on, their lanterns glowing in the dark like eyes of predators. Days stretched into nights, and the tension grew. Each snapped twig sent rifles snapping up, each shadow in the trees drew curses and nervous whispers. The hounds grew restless, as though they sensed their prey was not like the others they had chased. Stories began to spread among the hunters themselves. One swore he had seen Brutus standing in the moonlight, hammer in hand, towering like a demon, before vanishing into the woods. Another claimed the dogs refused to go near him, tails tucked, whining in fear. Fear turned into superstition. They began to whisper that Brutus was not entirely human, that no man could survive alone in the wilderness while hunted by so many. Some said he had the strength of 10 men, others that the devil himself had given him power. And still, Brutus endured. He moved through the land with the patience of a predator, striking only when cornered. One hunter was found with his skull caved in near a creek, his rifle broken beside him. Another disappeared entirely, the hounds returning alone, their mouths stained with blood not their own. Each loss only fueled the hunter's rage. More men were called, rewards were posted, posters nailed to trees with crude sketches. Wanted, Brutus, the Crusher, dead or alive. The price on his head climbed higher each week, but with every passing day, the legend of Brutus grew faster than the bounty. For in the slave quarters of Birmingham, whispers turned to murmurs, murmurs to chants. The Crusher lives, the Crusher runs free. His defiance became a spark of hope. To the enslaved, Brutus was not a fugitive. He was a hero, a living symbol that chains could be broken, that masters could bleed. To the hunters, he was something worse than a runaway. He was a ghost in the woods, a monster in the night, a living rebuke to their power. And so the hunt dragged on, stretching weeks into months. Birmingham burned with the fever of pursuit, yet Brutus remained beyond their reach, his hammer always near, his resolve unshaken, for Brutus was no longer merely running from death, he was running into legend. Every man has a breaking point. For Brutus it did not come in the furnace, nor under the lash. It came in the quiet hours of night, when the weight of injustice pressed hardest against his soul. The hammer had always been his companion. He held it daily, his calloused hands molded to its wooden handle, his muscles trained to its crushing weight. To Harrow, the hammer was just a tool of profit. To Brutus, it became something far more, a symbol of his suffering, and the weapon of his salvation. The breaking point arrived after a day of torment. Harrow had accused Brutus of working too slowly at the furnace. In truth, Brutus had outpaced every man, but Harrow's cruelty was not about justice, it was about control. He ordered Brutus stripped to the waist and tied to the post in front of the others. The whip lashed across his back, each strike tearing flesh. 10, 20, 30 lashes, blood streaked down his skin. The other slaves turned their eyes away, unable to watch. But Brutus did not make a sound. He clenched his jaw and stared at Harrow, his silence louder than screams. By the 40th lash, Harrow was trembling with rage. He wanted submission. He wanted fear. Instead, Brutus gave him defiance. That night, Brutus lay in the slave quarters, his back torn and burning. The whispers of the others circled around him. Some begged him to endure, warning that open rebellion meant death. Others prayed, fearing the wrath that would fall if Brutus struck back. But Brutus had made his choice. The hammer, once forced into his hand for labor, would become his instrument of justice. In the silence of the night, he stared at the tool resting near his cot. He could almost hear it calling him. Each scar on his body echoed a single truth. Chains could bind his flesh, but not his will. And if death was the price of freedom, then death would come to both master and slave alike. The decision was no longer a question of if. It was a matter of when. The breaking point had come. Brutus would not suffer another lash. The next time Harrow raised his hand in cruelty, the hammer would fall, not on iron but on bone, and history would remember the sound forever. Night in Birmingham carried a silence that was never truly silent. The hum of insects in the fields, the creak of the wooden cabins, the distant barking of Harrow's hounds, it all blended into a restless murmur that weighed on the souls of the enslaved. For Brutus, however, this night was different. This night carried purpose. For weeks, rage had burned in his chest like coal inside a furnace. He had endured years of lashes, insults, and humiliation. He had been treated as a beast, forced to perform like a trophy, his strength mocked as if it belonged to another man. And yet, he endured, waiting. But on this night, the wait ended. Brutus sat in the corner of the slave quarters, his body still scarred from the last whipping, the wounds aching with every breath. The dim firelight flickered across his face, shadows stretching over the iron-like ridges of his muscles. Around him, the other slaves lay in silence, pretending to sleep. Some feared what they knew he was planning. Others prayed for his soul, and some silently prayed he would succeed. The hammer rested beside him, a tool of labor forged for industry, its wooden handle stained with years of sweat. Brutus's hands closed around it slowly, reverently, as though greeting an old friend. It felt natural, almost destined. This hammer had built wealth for his master, shaped iron for his fortune. But tonight, it would shape destiny. Brutus's mind traveled back through years of torment. The first time he had been whipped as a boy, the first night he had seen Harrow drag a woman from her cabin, the countless times he had been forced to display his strength like a caged animal. Each memory was a spark, and together they became fire. He was no longer a slave waiting for freedom. He was a storm waiting to break. In the darkness, he rose. His footsteps were heavy, yet measured. The wooden boards creaked softly beneath his weight. No one moved, but all knew. Brutus's silence was louder than any words. He stepped outside into the night air. The moon was veiled by drifting clouds, casting only fragments of pale light across the plantation. The smell of iron and smoke lingered even now, mixed with the faint scent of blood still clinging to his torn back. The dog stirred but did not bark. Perhaps even they sensed something unnatural in him, something primal that silenced their instincts. Slowly, Brutus approached the main house. The towering structure loomed above him, its windows dark, save for the faint glow of a lantern in the master's study. Harrow was awake. He often was. Men who rule by fear seldom sleep peacefully. Brutus tightened his grip on the hammer. His breath was steady, his heartbeat thunderous yet controlled. For the first time in his life he felt no chain, no lash, no command. He felt only purpose. Inside the house, Harrow sat at his desk, sipping from a glass of whiskey, reviewing ledgers, filled with numbers that represented human lives, slaves reduced to profit margins. His thin lips curled into a cruel smirk as he scribbled notes, unaware that death was walking toward him. For Brutus, this was not murder. It was not rebellion. It was justice. A justice that the world of laws and chains would never give him. And, as he raised the hammer for the first time that night, the world seemed to hold its breath. The room was silent, save for the scratch of Ezekiel Harrow's quill against parchment. His lantern cast long, crooked shadows on the walls, turning the house into a cave of distorted shapes. He lifted his glass, sipped, and muttered to himself about profits and punishments. The door creaked open. Harrow's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. He expected a servant. Instead, in the dim glow of the lantern, he saw Brutus. The giant filled the doorway, the hammer glinting faintly in his hands. For the first time, Harrow did not see his beast of labor. He saw death. "Boy," Harrow spat, trying to mask his unease with authority. "What are you doing here? Get back to your quarters before I—" The words never finished. The hammer rose, slow at first, then faster, guided by every scar, every lash, every humiliation Brutus had ever endured. The muscles in his arms coiled like steel springs, his grip unbreakable, and then— impact. The hammer came down with a sound that would haunt every soul who heard it. A sickening crack, louder than bone should ever make, followed by a dull thud, as Harrow's skull gave way beneath the crushing weight. The force was so immense that the desk splintered beneath the body as it collapsed, blood spraying across ledgers, staining the pages of profit with the price of cruelty. For a moment, the world was still. Brutus stood over the body, chest heaving, the hammer dripping red, but rage is never satisfied with one strike. Again the hammer rose, again it fell. Each blow was a release, years of agony unleashed in brutal rhythm. The skull was no longer a skull, it was shattered fragments, bone and blood mingling into the wood. Harrow's body twitched, then stilled, lifeless. The sound of destruction filled the house, echoing like a drumbeat of vengeance. The slaves in their quarters heard it, their eyes wide in terror and awe. The overseers stirred in confusion, unsure of what nightmare was unfolding. When Brutus finally stopped, the man who had once ruled with fear was nothing more than a ruined corpse, unrecognizable even to those who knew him. The hammer, heavy and stained, slipped from Brutus's hand and hit the floor with a dull thud. The room smelled of iron, iron from the blood, not the furnace. Brutus did not smile. He did not laugh. His face was carved from stone, his eyes cold, his breath steady. This was not triumph. This was necessity. He turned from the body, leaving the study behind. For the first time, the chains in his mind felt broken. Yet freedom was not simple. He knew the house would awaken. The overseers would come, the hounds would be unleashed. His act had given him power, but it had also made him a hunted man. Still, as Brutus stepped out into the night, he carried no fear. The master was dead, the crusher had struck, and Birmingham would never forget the sound of that hammer. Birmingham, Alabama, a city built on iron, coal, sweat, and the broken backs of men who were never free. Beneath its rising smokestacks and railroads, there was another foundation, one written not in steel, but in blood. For every brick laid, there was a hand in chains. For every hammer strike, there was a scream silenced. Among the countless nameless slaves who toiled in the sweltering fields and furnaces of Birmingham, one name refused to vanish completely: Brutus. They whispered, his story in fragments, the slave who would not bend, the man who chose violence when all others bowed their heads, the one who took a sledgehammer, the same tool he had been forced to wield for his master's wealth, and turned it against the skull of the man who claimed to own him. But who was Brutus? Why did his name survive when so many others were buried in silence? To understand Brutus, we must first understand Birmingham itself in the mid-1800s. This was not yet the booming industrial city people recognize today. Birmingham was young, raw, and ruthless. Plantations still stretched across the land, and the South was choking on the rot of slavery. Men like Brutus were not seen as men at all, but as tools, bought, sold, branded, whipped, and worked until their souls broke. Brutus, however, was different. He was a giant of a man, born into chains, but possessing a strength that both impressed and terrified his captors. They called him the Crusher long before he killed anyone, because he could swing a hammer with the force of 10 men. He worked in the iron furnaces, pounding raw metal into shape, each strike echoing like thunder. His body was muscle and scars, his spirit unyielding. The other slaves looked at him not only with admiration, but with caution. To be strong in chains was dangerous. Masters hated strength, they feared defiance. And yet, Brutus carried both. It was said that when his master beat him, Brutus would not scream. When he was whipped until his back was raw, he stood in silence, blood dripping from his skin, staring directly into his master's eyes. That silence was not obedience, it was defiance. And defiance, in a world built on submission, was a crime greater than murder. The story of Brutus does not begin with his act of vengeance. It begins with years of suffering, humiliation, and cruelty so profound that his final act was not madness. It was destiny. Birmingham's soil was red with iron ore, and its air was black with smoke. Brutus labored day and night with a sledgehammer in his hand, shaping the wealth of others while his own life was nothing more than shackles and starvation. He slept on cold dirt floors, ate scraps thrown from the master's table, and lived under the constant threat of the whip. But within him, a storm brewed. Every insult, every lash, every moment of forced labor became fuel. Brutus was not just strong in body. He was strong in memory. He never forgot. He never forgave, and one day, the hammer he held would no longer build his master's fortune. It would shatter his master's skull. This is the story Birmingham tried to bury. The story of the slave who refused to die nameless. The man they called the Crusher. To understand Brutus's act of defiance, you must step into the world he was forced to endure, the world of chains. Imagine the furnace camps of Birmingham in the 1850s. Smoke thick in the air, the heat of molten iron burning the skin even from a distance. Slaves worked 12, sometimes 14 hours a day, swinging hammers, hauling ore and stoking fires until their hands blistered and bled. Among them was Brutus. His arms were like tree trunks, his chest broad, his shoulders carved by endless labor. But strength did not spare him suffering. It only brought harsher punishment. Masters demanded more from the strong, squeezing every ounce of power from their bodies until nothing remained but exhaustion. Brutus was owned by a man named Ezekiel Harrow. Harrow was not just a slave master, he was a tyrant who prided himself on breaking men. Tall, gaunt, and cold-eyed, Harrow believed cruelty was the only way to maintain control. He beat his slaves not for disobedience, but for sport. He starved them to remind them of dependence. He hunted escapees as if they were animals, boasting about his hounds that could smell a runaway for miles. And yet, even under Harrow's iron rule, Brutus did not break. When Harrow struck him, Brutus did not beg. When he whipped him, Brutus did not cry. Instead, Brutus's silence became a weapon, a reminder to Harrow that no matter what he did, he could not own the man's spirit, but silence had a cost. It made Harrow furious. He wanted screams, submission, fear. Brutus gave him none, and so Harrow made it his personal mission to humiliate Brutus in front of others. During meals, he would force Brutus to kneel and eat scraps from the ground. When Brutus lifted iron with ease, Harrow would taunt him, calling him beast, hammer, mule, and crusher. The name was meant as an insult, a reminder that Brutus was nothing more than a tool. But in the mouths of the other slaves, the crusher became something else. It became a name of respect, a whispered symbol of hope. For in Brutus, they saw something dangerous, proof that even in chains, a man could carry himself with dignity. Brutus, however, carried more than dignity. He carried rage. He watched as women were dragged from their cabins in the night. He heard the cries of children whipped for the smallest mistake. He saw men collapse from exhaustion, only to be kicked awake and forced back to work. And through it all, he felt the weight of his hammer in his hands, the one weapon he was allowed to hold, though only in service of his master's wealth. Each strike on the furnace was more than labor. It was rehearsal. In the dark corners of the slave quarters, Brutus's silence gave way to whispers. Some claimed he was planning something. Others said he was cursed, that no man could take so much punishment and remain sane. But Brutus was not insane. He was calculating. He knew that one day Harrow would push too far. One day the hammer would no longer fall on iron, it would fall on bone. The Harrow estate was not a grand palace. It was a fortress of fear, a sprawling plantation house surrounded by iron fences, barking hounds, and armed overseers. Ezekiel. Harrow ruled it not as a man, but as a tyrant whose power came from cruelty. Every inch of the property reminded the slaves of their place. The front porch where Harrow sat with a whip across his lap. The yard where men were chained to posts for punishment. The cellar where screams echoed at night, proof that mercy did not exist here. For Brutus, life under Harrow was a study in humiliation. Harrow believed in breaking men by stripping them of humanity. He would force slaves to dance for his amusement, whip them for smiling, and punish them for the smallest errors in work. To Harrow, brutality was not just control, it was entertainment. Brutus often found himself singled out. His strength was both useful and threatening. Harrow would boast of Brutus's power to visiting slaveholders, forcing him to demonstrate his might by lifting heavy stones or bending iron rods. Then, in the same breath, he would strike him with a cane, laughing as if to remind his guests. Even the strongest beast bows to the whip. But Brutus did not bow. He stood silent, his eyes locked on Harrow's. That silence infuriated the master more than any rebellion could. For in Brutus's gaze, Harrow saw something he could not destroy, a will unbroken. One night Harrow invited neighboring plantation owners to his estate. They drank bourbon on the porch, their voices thick with arrogance. In the courtyard below, he gathered his strongest slaves, Brutus among them. With a smirk, Harrow ordered Brutus to demonstrate his hammer strike. A block of iron ore was dragged into the yard, and Brutus was commanded to smash it. The hammer fell like thunder. The iron cracked in two. Gasps filled the night. "Behold," Harrow declared, "my crusher, strong enough to split stone, yet tame enough to eat from my hand." The laughter of the men echoed across the night air. But in that moment, Brutus felt something shift inside him. He realized Harrow's pride was built on his strength, yet his suffering was treated as a joke. He was no longer just a tool of labor. He was a trophy of humiliation. From that night forward, Brutus carried the memory like a burning coal. Each insult added fuel to his rage, each whip carved deeper into his resolve. Harrow had turned him into a spectacle, but Brutus was preparing for something else, not entertainment, not endurance, revenge. Birmingham never spoke of Brutus in its official records, yet the city could never silence him completely. For in the years that followed his vanishing, strange stories began to surface, stories that blurred the line between history and haunting. Plantation. Men whispered of dreams where they saw a towering figure with calloused hands, gripping a hammer slick with blood. Children, in the silence of night, claimed to hear heavy footsteps echoing through the woods. Dogs barked without reason, refusing to enter certain parts of the forest where Brutus had once fled. Was it fear? Was it guilt? Or was it the restless spirit of the man they had tried to erase? Slave catchers who had once hunted Brutus told chilling accounts. One man swore he saw him standing on the edge of a swamp, eyes glowing with a faint red shimmer before vanishing into mist. Another tracker, drunk in a tavern, admitted he quit the hunt because he felt Brutus was not a man anymore, but something else. "A man dies when the dogs tear him down," he muttered. But Brutus did not die. He became something bigger. White masters began to live in paranoia. They would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, convinced someone was standing at the foot of their bed. Some claimed to hear the clang of iron, the ringing sound of chains dragging along the floorboards. The hammer's echo followed them like a curse, and yet, among the enslaved, these same hauntings carried hope. They believed Brutus's spirit had not left the land, that he walked alongside them in the fields, watching, waiting. Mothers told their children, "Do not fear the night, for the night belongs to Brutus." Even long after slavery ended, the folklore endured. Older freedmen told their grandchildren never to enter the woods at dusk, for the crusher roams there. But in their warnings lay something more profound. Brutus was a reminder, a symbol of unfinished vengeance. The city of Birmingham itself seemed cursed by its silence. Fires broke out mysteriously on former plantations. Harrow's old mansion, rebuilt twice, collapsed again and again until no one dared touch the land. Locals began calling it the Hammered Ground. Historians later dismissed these stories as superstition. They argued Brutus was exaggerated, a myth shaped by fear. But to the people who lived in his shadow, he was not myth, he was presence. The very air of Birmingham carried his name, unspoken yet undeniable. And so Brutus became what he was never meant to be. A ghost haunting not just a family, not just a city, but an entire nation's conscience. He was the spirit of resistance that would not rest. The shadow that crept through history, whispering that no crime of oppression ever truly disappears. The haunting of Birmingham was not just supernatural, it was moral. Brutus was the wound they tried to bury, the scream they tried to silence, the truth they tried to erase. And wounds that deep never heal. They only bleed in silence. Legends age, but their lessons remain. And Brutus, the man, the killer, the fugitive, the ghost, did not simply belong to Birmingham or to the era of chains. He belongs to every age where power crushes the weak, where silence buries truth, where oppression pretends to be eternal. Today, his story stands as both warning and inspiration. For the oppressors, Brutus is warning. He reminds them that cruelty always creates resistance, that no matter how absolute control may appear, there is always a breaking point. Chains forge not only submission, but also rage. Every lash of the whip is a spark, and eventually the fire consumes its master. For the oppressed, Brutus is inspiration. He shows that resistance is never in vain, even if it does not win freedom immediately. His hammer blow was not the end of slavery, but it cracked the illusion of invulnerability. His escape did not topple the system, but it proved that the system could bleed, and perhaps most importantly, Brutus teaches us about memory. History may try to erase uncomfortable truths, but legends keep them alive. The silence of Birmingham's archives could not erase the whispers in its fields. The absence of monuments could not silence the fire in oral stories. This is why Brutus matters today. Because our world still carries chains, different in form but not in spirit. Injustice still thrives in the shadows. The powerful still write history to cleanse their crimes. And yet somewhere there is always a Brutus waiting. Think of modern prisons where men are caged like animals. Think of fields where exploited workers labor in silence. Think of streets where voices are silenced by those who fear their power. In each place, Brutus walks again. He is the defiance that cannot be erased, the rage that cannot be chained. But there is a darker lesson too. Brutus shows that violence is both liberation and curse. For though his hammer struck freedom into the imagination of the oppressed, it also struck fear into the heart of a community. His story is remembered not only as triumph, but as bloodshed, and therein lies the eternal paradox of rebellion. Freedom often comes wrapped in fire. The final lesson of Brutus is this: history's ghosts do not rest. When a people are crushed, when their cries are buried, when their pain is silenced, ghosts are born. And those ghosts do not vanish with time. They linger, they whisper, they demand to be remembered. Brutus is one such ghost, not only of Birmingham, not only of slavery, but of humanity itself. And so, when we speak of him today, we are not just recalling a fugitive slave who killed his master. We are summoning a truth that every generation must face. Oppression breeds resistance, silence breeds memory, and legends are born when power fears the truth. Brutus is not gone. He lives wherever men dare to whisper against chains, wherever rage refuses to bow, wherever the silence of history tries to smother truth. The crusher of Birmingham is eternal, a hammer that still swings in the shadows of time, a ghost who will not rest until freedom is no longer a dream, but a reality. No grave bears his name, no stone marks his resting place. No church ever prayed for his soul. Brutus, the giant who shattered Birmingham's silence with one bloody blow, vanished into history without a trace. But absence, too, is power. And Brutus's absence is louder than 1,000 monuments. For more than a century, whispers have circled the city. Some claim his body lies in the swamp where slave catchers lost his trail. Others insist he was torn apart by dogs, his remains scattered in the woods, never gathered, never mourned. There are those who believe he escaped entirely, northward, or perhaps into the hidden communities of the Maroons, those runaway enclaves that lived outside the white man's laws. And then there are the darkest tales. They claim Brutus never died at all, that his spirit refused burial, that his body roams the cursed woods around Birmingham, hammer still in hand, waiting for the day the soil itself rises with him. Every generation has tried to locate his tomb. Paranormal seekers wander through the marshes, listening for the clanging of chains. Historians dig into plantation records, searching for one last mention of him. Local children dare each other to enter the ruins of Harrow's burned estate, swearing that if you stay silent long enough, you can hear a hammer dragging across stone. But no matter how many search, no answer comes. Brutus is not found because Brutus does not belong to the ground. He belongs to the wound he left behind, and in that wound, the forgotten tomb takes form. Perhaps his tomb is not earth, but memory. Every tale whispered of him is a brick, Every nightmare of his hammer is the soil. Every heartbeat of rage in those still oppressed is the coffin that carries him forward. The irony is brutal. His master Harrow lies in an expensive graveyard, his name carved deep into marble. Visitors may walk there, polish his stone, recall his family's legacy. But Brutus, he lives only in whispers. And yet, it is Harrow's tomb that gathers dust, while Brutus's ghost still stirs terror. Which, then, is the greater immortality? The forgotten tomb of Brutus teaches us that legends are not buried in dirt. They are buried in silence, and silence, like soil, can be broken. Birmingham's soil itself is uneasy. Forests where he ran still feel heavy at night, as if the ground remembers the blood spilled upon it. Old plantations never thrive. Crops die in strange patterns. Houses collapse again and again. Those who try to build there report dreams of a hammer striking stone over and over, as though the earth refuses to be still. Brutus's tomb is nowhere, and everywhere, and perhaps that is exactly as he wanted. The story of Brutus does not end in Birmingham. It stretches beyond, into every whispered tale of rebellion, every memory of fire, every song of resistance carried by enslaved tongues. The hammer he wielded was not just iron. It was symbol, to his master. It was a tool of labor, meant to build wealth for another man. But in Brutus's hand, it became justice, raw, bloody, and undeniable. The blow that crushed Harrow's skull echoed far beyond the plantation walls. It shook the illusion of control. It declared that no chain was eternal, no whip absolute, no master invincible. And even though Brutus himself vanished, the hammer never left. Generations carried it forward, though unseen. In the hush of midnight gatherings, enslaved men and women told stories of him, of the giant who turned the master's tool into a weapon. They didn't always speak his name aloud for fear of punishment, but they spoke of the crusher, the one who proved that resistance was possible. As decades passed, the legend morphed. Some said he grew wings of fire. Others said he wandered the earth with chains around his wrists, breaking them one by one. In every telling, the hammer remained. When the Civil War broke out, black soldiers whispered of Brutus as they marched. Some carved crude hammers into their rifles, believing it gave them his strength. Union officers never understood why the men fought with such burning fury. But those men knew. They carried Brutus with them, and long after the war, when Jim Crow rose from the ashes, the hammer returned again. In secret societies, in rebel prayers, in the bloodied hands of those who refused to bow. The hammer became eternal, not because it killed one man, but because it symbolized a truth, that tools of oppression can be turned into weapons of freedom, that silence can be shattered with one strike, that even the forgotten can wield a power that echoes for centuries. But there is a darker shadow to this legacy too. For the hammer does not distinguish between justice and vengeance, and sometimes its weight falls upon the innocent as well as the guilty. In some versions of the legend, Brutus is not hero but monster, haunting even those he sought to protect. A spirit too consumed by rage to tell friend from foe. This duality is his eternal curse and his eternal power. To this day, in Birmingham, graffiti sometimes appears on crumbling walls, crude images of a hammer drawn in charcoal. No one knows who paints them. But locals say whenever injustice rises too high, the hammer returns, and in a way, that is the true immortality. Not marble, not books, not graves, but fire, shadow, and whispers. Brutus was born a slave. He died, if he ever truly died, a fugitive. Yet his name endures as more than man. He endures as symbol, as legend, as weapon. The eternal hammer swings, still. in every act of rebellion, in every whisper of resistance, in every chain that breaks, and until the world itself learns to live without chains, the crusher of Birmingham will never rest. The hammer should have brought closure. It should have been the end. One strike, one death, and freedom wrestled from the iron grip of cruelty. But legends do not rest where logic tells them to. Brutus's hammer did not stay silent. For decades after the night of Harrow's skull being shattered, strange accounts rippled through Birmingham. Slaves whispered that when the moon was red, they could hear the sound of a hammer slamming against stone somewhere in the woods. The noise echoed even when no man was there, a thunderous thud rolling through the trees. Sometimes those who ventured near would find trees split straight down the middle, as if by a weapon too large for mortal hands. The whites of Birmingham told their own stories, fearful in their candle-lit homes. Planters claimed their dogs refused to hunt in certain areas, howling and clawing to escape invisible terrors. Overseers said they dreamt of a giant shadow walking through the cotton fields, dragging chains like rivers of iron, his hammer glowing red in the night. Some even swore that those who spoke Brutus's name in scorn would be punished. There were whispers of overseers who mocked the tale, only to die within weeks, crushed by falling beams, trampled by horses, or found with their skulls cracked open in gruesome accidents. To the fearful, these were not coincidences. They were reminders. Brutus had not finished his work. What had begun as resistance was twisting into curse. Even the enslaved began to fear his shadow. For while Brutus's rage had struck against the master, his ghost seemed restless, indiscriminate. Some said he could not tell master from slave anymore, that in his death, or undeath, he was chained not to justice, but to violence itself. Wherever suffering reigned, the hammer fell again, and so Brutus became dual. To the oppressed, he was the burning dream of freedom. To the fearful, he was a monster of vengeance, a figure who had stared into hatred so long he had become it. The curse of the hammer was this: it did not merely liberate, it demanded blood. One chilling tale comes from 1887, long after the Civil War had ended. A group of children in Birmingham dared each other to spend a night in the ruins of Harrow's plantation house. They returned pale, trembling, unable to speak. Only one survived into adulthood, and even he would mutter of a giant shadow that stood at the end of the hallway, hammer in hand, its breath rattling like fire in a furnace. He said it watched them, unmoving, until the bravest boy picked up a stone and threw it. The hammer struck once, the house collapsed. The children never spoke again. Whether true or not, the story endures. For every town haunted by injustice needs its spectre, and Brutus's hammer is Birmingham's curse, and maybe that curse was necessary. Maybe it was never about peace. Maybe the point of Brutus's legend was to leave a scar that never heals. So, the city would never forget what was done and what was taken. Justice turned to haunting, and the hammer kept falling. Brutus is no longer man. Brutus is no longer even ghost. Brutus is myth, and myths do not die. In Birmingham today, his presence still lingers. Children dare each other to walk through the woods after dark, swearing they can hear metal dragging across stone. Old folks tell stories in hushed tones, warning the young that the hammer does not forgive cowardice. And in activist circles, his name is spoken again, not as monster, but as symbol of raw defiance. This is the paradox of Brutus. He is both savior and terror, both liberator and curse, both the man who struck down his oppressor and the shadow who cannot rest. Historians struggle with his story. Some insist he never existed, that Brutus was a composite, a myth created by the enslaved to embody resistance. They say no man could have killed Harrow so cleanly, vanished so completely. To them, the hammer was metaphor. But legends do not survive this long without truth at their core. And in Brutus's story, truth burns hotter than fact. For whether he was one man or many, flesh or spirit, hammer or dream, his legend has shaped Birmingham more than marble statues or courthouse speeches ever could. To the oppressed, Brutus is justice that refuses compromise. To the guilty, Brutus is the nightmare that follows them into the grave. This duality is the essence of myth. Heroes become gods, and gods become monsters. And Brutus stands in both realms. The final judgment of Brutus is not about whether he was good or evil. It is about what he reveals of us. He shows that rage, once awakened, cannot be chained again. He shows that violence, born from centuries of cruelty, will echo even after the whip is gone. He shows that history does not bury its sins, it resurrects them in the form of hammers, shadows, and blood. Perhaps that is why no tomb holds him. Perhaps that is why his hammer still swings in the dark. Brutus is not buried because Brutus is not finished, and so his story ends where it began, in fire, in blood, in shadow. The crusher of Birmingham, the slave who killed his master with a sledgehammer, will never be laid to rest. For some wounds never heal, some curses never lift, and some legends refuse to die. The story of Brutus should have ended on that single night in Birmingham, with one swing of the sledgehammer that cracked a skull and rewrote a destiny. Yet history, like a wound, never heals in a straight line. It festers, it bleeds, it echoes. Brutus's name did not vanish into the dirt the way his enslavers wished. It lived on, first as a whisper, then as a legend, then as a haunting shadow that draped itself over the city of Birmingham like smoke that refused to lift. The truth of Brutus's fate, whether he died in the fields, whether he escaped into the mountains, whether he was burned alive in secrecy, remains uncertain. But what is certain is that his act lived longer than any one body could. The blow of his hammer did not end with bone and blood. It rippled outward, through generations, through the very soil, until even now, the city of Birmingham carries that sound within its veins. Some say history is written in books. But in the South, history is written in whispers. It is passed through kitchen stories, through porch-side tales told in the humidity of night, through hymns sung too softly for outsiders to hear. And in those whispers, Brutus never died. He became something larger, something immortal, something that terrified both the oppressed and the oppressors alike. The birth of a folklore ghost among the enslaved people of Birmingham, Brutus's name became code. A secret word. Mothers would hush crying children with it, "Be still, or Brutus will come." But in their eyes, it was not a threat. It was a shield. For Brutus was no mere man anymore. He was the proof that chains could break, that masters could bleed, that fear could be reversed. His story traveled plantation to plantation in fragments. He killed him with one blow. They say he walked out covered in blood. Some swear he vanished into the woods and the trees hid him. What was fact and what was fiction ceased to matter. What mattered was the possibility that an enslaved man had risen, shattered the skull of his master, and become a phantom too powerful to cage. By the 1870s, even freedmen whispered his story. Around campfires, they called him the Crusher, the Hammer of Birmingham, the Ghost in the Fields. It wasn't just a tale. It was a liturgy, a way of keeping alive the rage and the hope that slavery had sought to crush. But among the white population, his name struck a different note. For them, Brutus was not a symbol of freedom, but of terror. The mere idea of him, a slave who had risen and destroyed the sanctity of the master's authority, was an infection in their memory. They spoke of him like a demon, like something cursed that haunted Birmingham's soil. It was not unusual for white landowners to warn their children in the late 19th century, "Don't stray into the fields after dark." That's where Brutus walks. A man had become a ghost, and a ghost had become history. The hammer that wouldn't stop ringing, it is said that the sound of a hammer blow never truly ends. Physicists speak of vibrations, of echoes, of waves that continue beyond hearing. Brutus's sledgehammer was no different. Though the weapon itself was likely taken, hidden, or destroyed, its strike reverberated. Even today, when workers dig the earth near certain plantations, they claim to feel vibrations in the soil, like a pulse, like a memory that refuses burial. In oral folklore, there are repeated accounts of the hammer's echo. Former sharecroppers in the 1900s would swear that during harvest season, in the dead of night, they would hear the faint metallic clang of a hammer striking bone carried on the wind. Dogs would bark, horses would spook, and the air would tighten in silence afterward. Some modern paranormal investigators who have explored abandoned Birmingham estates describe hearing a rhythmic thump, steady, slow, inhuman, beneath the floorboards. They call it the heartbeat of the house. Locals call it something else. Brutus, reminding the land that one strike can topple an empire. Hauntings in the new Birmingham. When Birmingham industrialized, new factories rose where old plantations once stood. Iron furnaces, steel mills, coal mines, all demanded labor, often from the same black men who had once been enslaved. And as they worked, stories of Brutus seeped into the smoke. In the 1920s, an ironworker named Elijah Carter swore that in the Sloss furnaces he once saw a shadowy figure, massive and silent, holding a hammer larger than any tool. Its eyes burned like coal, its breath like steam. The figure stood among the flames watching, before vanishing into the smoke. Elijah never forgot. He told younger workers, who told their sons, who told their grandsons. The legend of Brutus shifted from the fields to the furnaces. Even today, Sloss is considered haunted. Tour guides will tell you about the accidents, the fires, the screams. But among older black families, a different story is told. That's where Brutus walks. Now, he traded the fields for the furnaces. His hammer is still swinging. The hammer in songs and sermons. The blues, born from the South's pain, often carried Brutus's echo. Though never named directly, too dangerous in certain decades, the imagery was unmistakable. A man with a hammer. A master brought low. A field soaked in blood. One forgotten blues song, recorded on wax cylinder in the 1910s, carried the verse, "Swing that hammer, let it fall, chains can't bind me, break them all." Historians often attribute this to generic labor imagery. But in Birmingham, listeners knew. The hammer was Brutus's, the blood was his master's. The song was a hymn of vengeance disguised as work. Even sermons carried him. In certain hidden black churches, preachers would compare Moses striking Egypt with Brutus striking Birmingham. God sends his angels, they would say, but sometimes he sends a hammer. Congregations would nod, silent but burning inside. Brutus had become not only a ghost, but a prophet. White fear and the erasure of Brutus. Yet where the oppressed carried Brutus as a symbol of survival, the oppressors sought to erase him. Newspapers in Birmingham never reported his act in detail. The archives contained scraps, mentions of a disturbance, of a runaway, of an incident of violence. But the name Brutus is absent, erased deliberately, cut out like a disease from the record. Why? Because Brutus was proof that slavery was not natural, that slaves were not docile, that masters were not gods. He was the fracture in the illusion. To acknowledge him would have been to admit that the system was built on lies. So instead, they buried him under silence. But silence is not death. Silence is an invitation for the story to grow wilder, darker, unstoppable. Brutus became what they feared most, a myth beyond their control. The return of the hammer. By the mid-20th century, during the civil rights movement, Brutus returned like a storm. Young activists in Birmingham, beaten by police, threatened by dogs, hosed by fire, whispered his name again. They wrote it on bathroom walls. They scrawled it in chalk on sidewalks. For them, Brutus was not merely a ghost, he was the proof that resistance was older than America itself. One marcher in 1963 recalled, "When they dragged me into jail, the man next to me leaned over and whispered, 'Brutus swung first. We just keep swinging.' And I never forgot that." The hammer had returned, not in steel, but in voices, in marches, in songs of freedom. Every chant of "We shall overcome" carried beneath it the deeper echo of Brutus's hammer. The unfinished symphony was being played again, with new instruments. The unfinished symphony Brutus's act was not the end of something. It was the beginning of a song that still hasn't ended. The first note was a hammer's strike in Birmingham. The next notes came in marches, in blues songs, in sermons, in protests. But the song is incomplete, because the echo of Brutus is not just about the past. It asks a question that America has never fully answered. What happens when the oppressed strike back? What happens when the skull of power is shattered? What happens when the hammer falls again? It is a question that lingers in Birmingham's streets, in its factories, in its abandoned plantations. Every generation hears it differently. Some hear it as terror, others as hope. But all hear it. The modern ghost today, visitors to Birmingham, still report strange experiences. Paranormal investigators in the early 2000s described hearing metallic bangs in the woods at night, even when no tools were nearby. Tourists walking through old plantation trails spoke of a heavy presence, as though followed by a man too massive to be seen. One chilling account came from a group of college students who camped near an abandoned plantation site in 2012. Around midnight, they swore they heard footsteps circling their tent, slow, deliberate, heavy. Then came a sound like iron dragging across stone. When they opened the tent, nothing was there. But in the dirt, they claimed, was a single, fresh imprint. A hammerhead. Historians dismiss it, locals don't. For them, Brutus is still out there, unfinished, echoing. The hammer never stopped. Conclusion. The echo that will not die Brutus is not merely a man, not merely a ghost, not merely a story. He is an unfinished symphony of blood and iron, of fear and freedom. His act in Birmingham was the first note, struck so hard it cracked not only a skull, but the illusion of power itself. The echo of that strike continues, in fields, in factories, in protests, in songs, in whispers. And every echo asks the same question: who will swing the hammer next? Brutus's story was never about ending chains, it was about beginning echoes. And those echoes still walk Birmingham's soil, heavy as footsteps, loud as thunder, eternal as vengeance. The symphony is unfinished, and perhaps it always will be. The story of Brutus does not end with his final breath, nor with the fading of his footprints into the swamps of Alabama. No, Brutus became something larger, something heavier, something terrifying. He became an eternal shadow, a symbol that refuses to die, a hammer strike echoing endlessly through America's blood-soaked soil. To tell his story is not to close a book. It is to open a wound. Brutus was once flesh, chained, and beaten. He was once a man of scars and muscle, of sweat and fire. But when his sledgehammer came crashing down upon the skull of his master, he transcended the boundaries of mortality. He became a myth. He became the whisper in the dark corners of Birmingham's streets, the ghost that haunts plantation ruins, The memory that American history tried desperately to bury but could not suffocate. And in this, Brutus became more than a fugitive slave. He became America's dark conscience. The unhealed wound America has always wrestled with the ghosts of its sins. The slave ships, the auction blocks, the branding irons, the lash of the whip. These are wounds stitched over with patriotic songs and gilded monuments, but underneath, the infection festers. And Brutus? Brutus was the wound that could never close. Where most enslaved people endured silently, where rebellion was crushed quickly, Brutus's act was different. It was not only a killing, it was a spectacle of violent reclamation. A man once stripped of humanity, now seizing it back with a single crushing blow. It terrified slaveholders, it thrilled whispers among the enslaved, and it reminded America of something it desperately wanted to forget. That the people it held in chains were not docile cattle, but human beings. Capable of rage, capable of justice, capable of revolution. That is why Brutus's story was erased from textbooks, hidden from polite conversations, buried beneath layers of silence. Because Brutus's hammer was not just a weapon, it was a prophecy. It warned of the day when the oppressed would no longer kneel, myth or memory. Some say Brutus survived his escape, that he became a ghost among the swamps, striking down any man who carried the whip of slavery. Others claim he was captured and executed, his body torn apart as a warning to others. But no matter what happened to his flesh, his legend endured. Children of the enslaved whispered about him around fire pits. The crusher will come, they said, when the master grows cruel. His name became a prayer, a warning, a promise. And decades later, when slavery was abolished, his story did not vanish. It transformed. For African Americans facing lynchings, in the Jim Crow era, Brutus was the phantom avenger, the spirit who embodied their suppressed fury. For the white South, he was the bogeyman, the symbol of what they feared most, the rebellion of the oppressed. Even into the 20th century, rumors lingered. Workers claimed they saw him walking along railroad tracks at night, his hammer gleaming under the moonlight. Tourists in Birmingham reported strange sounds echoing in abandoned factories, the rhythmic clang of iron against skull. Whether myth or memory, Brutus refused to die. The eternal hammer to understand Brutus is to understand America itself. The hammer that Brutus held was not merely iron. It was history forged into steel. Every ounce of rage from centuries of slavery poured into its swing, and when it came down, it did not only shatter a skull, it cracked the mask of American innocence. Brutus reminds us that freedom was never given. It was taken. Blood was the currency of liberation. That is why his shadow lingers in the American psyche. Every time injustice grows unbearable, every time chains take new forms, whether in prisons, poverty, or racial violence, Brutus's hammer is heard again. A soundless echo that rattles in the bones of the nation. Boom, boom, boom. It is the sound of reckoning, the monster and the martyr, but here lies the paradox. Was Brutus a monster, or was he a martyr? To the slaveholding South, he was the devil incarnate, proof that black men were dangerous, proof that they must be kept chained. His act was cited as justification for cruelty, for surveillance, for fear. In their eyes, he was not human but beast. Yet to the enslaved, Brutus was not a monster. He was a liberator, a flicker of justice in a world of endless torment. He was the embodiment of resistance, the proof that even the mightiest oppressor could bleed. This duality is why his shadow is eternal. Brutus forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. Was his act justified? Was it justice or revenge? Does morality exist in a world built on chains and whips? Or is violence the only language tyranny understands? Brutus's hammer does not answer these questions. It only asks them over and over as its echo reverberates through time. America's dark. Conscience, think of it. America, a nation that calls itself the land of freedom, built on slavery. America, a nation that preaches equality while burying stories like Brutus's under silence. The contradiction is unbearable, and that is why Brutus is still here. He is not a ghost wandering plantations. He is not a monster lurking in swamps. He is deeper, heavier. He is a conscience. Every time America boasts of its greatness, Brutus stands in the shadows, hammer in hand, whispering, "Remember me." Every time a black body falls under police brutality, his shadow darkens the streets. Every time justice is denied, the echo of his hammer shakes the ground. Brutus is eternal not because of what he did, but because of what America has never done, fully confront its own sins. The final echo. In the end, Brutus is more than a story. He is a warning. As long as oppression exists, as long as inequality festers, the hammer of Brutus waits. His legend reminds us that silence breeds rebellion, that cruelty breeds vengeance, that chains will always be broken, violently if not willingly. The eternal shadow of Brutus does not fade. It grows, it spreads, it infects the conscience of America. And with every injustice, the hammer rises higher. Boom, boom, boom. Do you hear it? That is Brutus. That is the sound of reckoning. That is the eternal shadow the conscience America cannot escape. And until the wound is healed, until the truth is faced, until justice is real, the crusher of Birmingham will never rest.